There exists a peculiar weariness that settles into the bones after certain encounters, a depletion that feels almost vampiric in its thoroughness. You might wake with reserves of vitality, ready to engage the world, only to find yourself hollowed out after a brief conversation with that one colleague who specializes in catastrophe. Or perhaps it is the relative who phones exclusively to deposit their grievances at your doorstep, leaving you to sort through emotional debris that was never yours to begin with. This exhaustion runs deeper than simple fatigue. It seeps into the marrow, creating a heaviness that sleep cannot cure. The modern world has developed convenient terminology for those who seem to extract our life force through mere proximity. We label them toxic, narcissistic, emotionally vampiric. We construct elaborate defenses, visualizing protective bubbles of light, burning sage, maintaining careful distance. Yet these measures often prove as substantial as tissue paper against rain. Carl Jung proposed something far more unsettling than the existence of energy predators stalking through our daily interactions. He suggested that the drainage we experience originates not from external assault, but from an internal recognition, a resonance between what lies dormant within us and what manifests openly in another. This perspective transforms the entire landscape of emotional protection from one of defense against invaders to one of understanding our own hidden territories. The mechanism Jung identified operates through what he termed psychic contamination. Imagine two tuning forks placed near each other. Strike one, and the other begins to vibrate at the same frequency without being touched. Human psyches function similarly when unconscious material remains unintegrated. The unresolved grief, suppressed anger, or denied neediness of another person finds its twin frequency within our own psychological structure, setting it into sympathetic vibration. This contamination occurs beneath the threshold of awareness. You meet someone carrying a burden of unprocessed guilt, and suddenly you find yourself apologizing for things that require no apology. You interact with someone drowning in their own neediness, and inexplicably you feel responsible for their rescue. Their emotional state has not invaded you so much as activated what already existed in your psychological basement, waiting for the right frequency to bring it to life. The individuals most susceptible to this drainage often share specific developmental histories. They emerged from childhoods where emotional availability determined survival. Perhaps they had a parent who withdrew affection unless the child performed emotional labor, listening to adult problems, mediating conflicts, becoming a miniature therapist before learning multiplication tables. Or they navigated a household where love arrived only through the portal of being needed, useful, indispensable. These early experiences create a template that persists into adulthood. The child who learned that their value resided in their capacity to absorb others. Pain becomes the adult who attracts every wounded soul within a 50-mile radius. They mistake this magnetic pull for compassion, viewing their ability to feel others' emotions as a gift rather than recognizing it as an outdated survival mechanism. True empathy maintains boundaries. It recognizes the suffering of another without becoming merged with that suffering. But those who experience early emotional neglect often cannot distinguish between understanding someone as pain and taking ownership of it. They absorb emotions like sponges absorb water, with no conscious control over the process. They become walking repositories for the unprocessed feelings of everyone they encounter. This fusion happens automatically, bypassing conscious choice entirely. You might intellectually understand that your friend's depression belongs to them, not you. Yet after spending time together, you carry their melancholy home like an unwanted souvenir. You know rationally that your colleague's anxiety about their performance review has nothing to do with your life, but somehow their nervous energy colonizes your evening, leaving you restless and agitated. The tragedy lies not just in the exhaustion, but in the misconception. These individuals often view themselves as natural healers, empaths, highly sensitive people. They wear their porosity as a badge of honor, not recognizing it as evidence of incomplete psychological development. They pride themselves on understanding others deeply, while remaining strangers to their own depths. Jung observed that we cannot perceive in others what we have not first encountered in ourselves. The manipulative person who leaves us feeling drained can only affect us because we carry our own unacknowledged capacity for manipulation. The endlessly needy individual who exhausts us resonates with our own denied neediness. The victim who never takes responsibility mirrors our own hidden tendency to avoid accountability. This recognition proves uncomfortable because it disrupts the clean narrative of predator and prey. It suggests that the drama of energy drainage requires two participants, both operating from unconscious scripts written long ago. The so-called vampire can only feed where there exists an open vein, and that opening was created not by them, but by our own unexamined history. Consider how certain individuals affect you disproportionately, while others leave no lasting impression. The difference lies not in their behavior, but in what their behavior activates within your psychological structure. Someone's anger might slide off you like water off glass, while their disappointment penetrates to your core. This selective vulnerability maps the geography of your own unintegrated material. The protection we seek, therefore, cannot come from external barriers. No amount of visualization or energetic hygiene will seal cracks that exist within our own foundation. The work required goes deeper than technique, demanding instead a willingness to examine what we have spent lifetimes avoiding. It asks us to identify not just who drains us, but what within us responds to their particular frequency of dysfunction. This understanding shifts the locus of power. Rather than remaining victims of others' emotional states, we become investigators of our own psychological architecture. We begin to recognize the early warning signs of contamination, not as signals to flee, but as invitations to explore what has been activated within us. Jung mapped the human psyche into four primary functions through which we navigate reality: thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuition. Each individual develops one function dominantly, wielding it like a master craftsman with a favored tool. But this specialization comes at a cost. While we polish our primary function to brilliance, another lies neglected in the psychological basement, primitive and underdeveloped. Jung called this the inferior function, and it represents our greatest vulnerability to psychological contamination. The inferior function operates like a child in an adult's body, impulsive, easily overwhelmed, prone to magical thinking. If thinking dominates your psychological landscape, then feeling remains infantile. You might navigate complex intellectual problems with ease while becoming paralyzed by simple emotional situations. A colleague's tears reduce you to confused silence. A partner's emotional needs feel like impossible equations written in an alien language. This underdeveloped function becomes the unlocked door through which others' psychological material enters uninvited. The thinking type finds themselves invaded by the chaotic emotions of others, precisely because they lack the sophisticated filtering system that a developed feeling function would provide. They absorb emotional states wholesale, unable to sort, evaluate, or reject what does not belong to them. Similarly, the feeling type who has relegated thinking to the shadows becomes vulnerable to logical manipulation. They sense something wrong in the twisted arguments of a manipulator, but cannot construct the rational framework to defend against it. They know in their bones that they are being deceived, yet the deception occurs in a language they never learned to speak fluently. The inferior function betrays us through its very invisibility. We remain unaware of its primitive operations, mistaking its reactions for reality. When someone activates this function, we lose our psychological sophistication. We regress to earlier developmental stages, responding from a place of childhood rather than adult capability. This regression happens so swiftly that we only recognize it afterward, wondering why we acted so unlike ourselves. Consider the highly intuitive person whose inferior sensing function leaves them vulnerable to those who weaponize concrete reality. They live in patterns and possibilities, reading the undercurrents of situations with remarkable accuracy. Yet someone who insists on literal interpretations, who demands physical evidence, who reduces everything to material facts, can destabilize them completely. Their ethereal strength becomes their earthly weakness. The shadow adds another layer to this vulnerability. Jung understood the shadow not as evil, but as everything we cannot accept about ourselves. Every quality we deny possessing gets pushed into this psychological territory. The person who prides themselves on generosity harbors stinginess in their shadow. The one who identifies as strong carries their weakness there. The helper hides their need to be helped. These shadow contents do not disappear through denial. They seek expression, and finding none in direct form, they project themselves onto others. We see in the external world what we refuse to acknowledge internally. The characteristics that trigger us most violently in others are often precise maps of our own shadow material. That colleague whose arrogance infuriates you beyond reason might be carrying the projection of your own disowned pride. You rage against their self-importance precisely because you have banished your own healthy self-assertion to the shadow. Their behavior would be merely annoying if it did not resonate with something you work overtime to suppress. The shadow operates through emotional charge. Neutral observation indicates shadow absence. But when someone's behavior generates disproportionate emotional response, when you find yourself obsessing about their flaws, rehearsing arguments against them, feeling physically agitated by their presence, you have encountered your own shadow worn as another's face. This mechanism explains why certain people exhaust us, while others do not. The exhaustion comes not from their behavior alone, but from the psychological effort required to maintain our conscious identity against the shadow material they activate. We spend enormous energy keeping the shadow at bay, insisting we are not like them, could never be like them, despise everything they represent. Yet the shadow contains not only what we consider negative, but also positive qualities we cannot claim. The person who sees themselves as ordinary might project their own brilliance onto others, then feel diminished in their presence. Someone convinced of their unworthiness projects their value onto others, and feels drained trying to earn what they already possess, but cannot recognize. The relationship between inferior function and shadow creates a perfect storm of vulnerability. The inferior function lacks the development to process certain experiences skillfully, while the shadow ensures we remain blind to what those experiences activate within us. Together, they form a psychological Achilles heel that others can strike without even knowing they have done so. A person operating from their shadow can hook directly into your inferior function. If your shadow contains disowned neediness and your inferior function is feeling, then someone who embodies open emotional neediness can create a double resonance. They activate both what you cannot develop and what you will not acknowledge. The result feels like psychological invasion, though in truth, it is more like looking into a funhouse mirror that shows your hidden face. This dynamic operates bidirectionally. While you project your shadow onto others, they simultaneously project theirs onto you. In unconscious relationships, two people can spend years locked in mutual projection, each seeing in the other what they cannot see in themselves, each exhausted by maintaining defenses against their own rejected qualities. Breaking free requires recognizing that the exhaustion signals not attack, but recognition. The fatigue indicates not that someone is stealing your energy, but that you are expending energy to avoid seeing yourself. The drama of energy drainage is actually the drama of resistance to self-knowledge. What exhausts us is not the other, but our own refusal to acknowledge what the other reveals. Understanding this transforms the entire paradigm. Rather than seeking protection from energy vampires, we begin seeking integration of what they show us. Instead of building higher walls, we start exploring what within us responds to their call. The journey shifts from defense to discovery, from victimhood to ownership of our complete psychological territory. Jung borrowed from alchemical tradition when he described the opus contra naturam, the work against nature. The alchemists sought to transform base metals into gold through processes that defied natural tendency. Jung saw this as metaphor for psychological transformation, the deliberate effort to move against the gravitational pull of unconscious patterns. This work demands we resist every automatic response, question every inherited assumption, develop every neglected capacity. The psyche prefers homeostasis. It seeks to maintain familiar patterns, even when those patterns create suffering. The person who always sacrifices their needs finds comfort in that sacrifice, despite the resentment it breeds. The one who merges with others' emotions knows no other way of connecting, despite the exhaustion it creates. These patterns feel like identity itself. To change them feels like death. Yet this death is precisely what Jung prescribed. Not literal death, but the dissolution of the false self that maintains itself through unconscious repetition. Every time you act against your automatic pattern, something dies and something else is born. The compulsive helper who finally says no experiences the death of that identity and the birth of someone who can choose when to give and when to withhold. This work cannot be accomplished through insight alone. Understanding why you absorb others' emotions changes nothing if you continue absorbing them. Recognizing your shadow projections means little if you still see others as carriers of your disowned qualities. The opus contra naturam requires action that contradicts everything that feels natural, safe, known. Begin with small rebellions against your psychological type. If you live in your head, spend time in your body without trying to think about what you are feeling. Simply feel. If emotions rule your inner world, practice observing them with the detachment of a scientist noting data. If you trust only what you can touch and measure, venture into imagination without requiring it to prove itself practical. These exercises feel uncomfortable, sometimes unbearable. The thinking type forced to navigate feeling might experience panic at the loss of rational ground. The feeling type attempting cold analysis might feel they are betraying their very soul. This discomfort signals not danger, but development. You are strengthening the psychological muscles that atrophied through neglect. The inferior function requires particular attention. Like rehabilitating an injured limb, you must work it gently but consistently. If feeling is inferior, practice identifying emotions with the same precision you would apply to solving mathematics. Create an emotional vocabulary. Notice the difference between frustration and anger, between sadness and melancholy. These distinctions, obvious to a feeling type, require conscious effort from one whose feeling lies underdeveloped. Shadow work proceeds through a different mechanism. Here, you must catch your projections in the act. When someone triggers intense reaction, pause before indulging the reaction. Ask what quality in them you cannot tolerate, then search for that quality within yourself. Not the obvious version, but the subtle manifestation. You might not be overtly arrogant like your triggering colleague, but perhaps you carry intellectual arrogance about your humility. This recognition initially brings shame. We discover we are everything we claimed not to be. The helper finds their selfishness. The victim discovers their persecution of others. The saint uncovers their sinner. Yet this shame transforms into relief. The energy spent maintaining the false divide between self and shadow becomes available for living. You no longer need to police yourself so vigilantly because you have acknowledged the prisoner was always you. As integration progresses, something remarkable occurs. The people who once drained you begin to affect you less. Not through your resistance, but through your non-resonance. When you own your neediness, the openly needy person no longer hooks that disowned part. When you acknowledge your capacity for manipulation, the manipulator cannot activate what you already consciously hold. You become psychologically transparent to their unconscious seeking. This transformation puzzles those accustomed to your old patterns. The relative who always called with problems finds you mysteriously unavailable, not through avoidance, but through genuine disinterest in playing savior. The colleague who triggered your shadow projections becomes merely another person with their own struggles, no longer a screen for your denied qualities. They might escalate, trying to restore the familiar dynamic, but they find no purchase. Some relationships do not survive this transformation. They required your unconsciousness to function, your willingness to absorb unlimited emotion, to carry others' shadows, to operate from your inferior function, formed the foundation of connection. When that foundation dissolves, the relationship either evolves or ends. This loss, though painful, reveals the relationship's parasitic nature. What felt like connection was actually unconscious fusion. New relationships emerge from different ground. People appear who can meet you in consciousness rather than neurosis. They neither drain nor need to be drained. Energy flows bidirectionally, each person maintaining their own psychological boundaries while remaining genuinely connected. These relationships feel foreign initially, lacking the intense charge of unconscious dynamics. Yet they offer something more valuable than intensity: genuine intimacy without fusion. The opus contra naturam never truly ends. Layers of unconscious material surface throughout life, requiring continued vigilance and work. But the process becomes less effortful over time. What once required tremendous will become second nature. You develop an internal alarm system that alerts you when you slip toward old patterns. You catch projections before they solidify, recognize inferior function activation before it overwhelms. This psychological sophistication renders you effectively invisible to those who seek unconscious feeding. They pass by like predators, unable to detect prey that no longer emits the scent of vulnerability. Not through protection or shielding, but through completion. You have integrated what they seek to activate. You have developed what they attempt to exploit. You have become whole where they require fragments. The freedom this brings defies description. You walk through the world no longer bracing against invasion. You engage with difficult people without armor, because there exists nothing in you for their dysfunction to grip. Your energy remains your own, not through hoarding, but through natural containment. You give when you choose, withhold when appropriate, remain present without merging. This is Jung's promise. Not a life without challenge, but a life without unconscious contamination. Not relationships without conflict, but conflicts that clarify rather than drain. Not immunity from difficult people, but immunity from being unconsciously affected by them. The goal the alchemists sought was always this: the transformed human who has claimed their complete nature, shadow and light, strength and weakness, conscious and unconscious, forged into one indivisible whole.